Dean Corbett's phone rang hard in his hand. Sudden, urgent, the kind of ring that doesn't wait. He grabbed her arm and yanked her down into the seat. She dropped hard, hip first, body jerking sideways before she caught the edge of the table. Right beside them, close enough to reach out and touch the booth, a biker had his fork halfway to his mouth. The stumble caught his eye before anything else did. He didn't move, just watched. She felt him watching. Her eyes flicked to him for half a second, just long enough to know he'd seen, and her hand came up off the table. Palm turned in, fingers spread, chest height. She held it there, shaking, while Dean was already pressing the phone to his ear, already turning half away, already forgetting she existed for the next 60 seconds. That was enough. Earl Dunmore set his fork down. What he did next, nobody at that counter ever forgot. This is Heart Tales. Now, let's find out what happened that day. Earl Dunmore did not stand up. He set his fork down slow, the way a man moves when he doesn't want the sound of metal on porcelain to mean anything to anyone watching. Dean was still on the call, voice low, one hand flat on the table, fingers tapping. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again. A rhythm that belonged to a man closing something, not a man comforting someone. Claire's hand was back in her lap. But her eyes hadn't moved off Earl. Not staring, just checking. The way you check a door is still locked, over and over, even after you already know. Earl didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't do anything a camera would catch as meaningful. He reached into his vest and pulled out a phone older than the one in Dean's hand. A flip phone, the kind people stopped carrying 15 years ago. He opened it under the table, typed 4 words. Bristlecone Diner, Route 9. Dean's voice sharpened for half a second. Something on the other end of his call had gone wrong, and his free hand came down flat on the table, hard enough that the salt shaker jumped. Claire flinched. Earl saw that too. He closed the phone, slid it back into his vest, picked his coffee back up like nothing in the last 90 seconds had happened at all. Dean stood. He didn't look at Claire. He walked toward the window at the far end of the diner, phone still pressed to his ear, back turned to the room. The second his back was turned, something in Claire's shoulders let go. Just slightly. Just enough that Earl noticed the difference even from 2 tables away. She didn't move again. She didn't need to. She'd already done the only thing she could do. Now it was someone else's turn. Earl kept his eyes on the window at the edge of his vision, tracking Dean's back, counting the seconds the way he'd learned to count them a long time ago. Not out of nerves, but out of habit. The kind that never really leaves a man once he's had a reason to build it. 90 seconds. Dean was still talking. Earl's phone buzzed once against his ribs. A single word came back. Received. He didn't react to that either. Maddie came by with the coffee pot, topped off his cup without being asked, and for 1 second, no longer, her eyes met his. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She'd been working this counter long enough to know the difference between a man eating breakfast and a man doing something else entirely. Dean's call ended. He turned back toward the table, sliding his phone into his jacket, already reaching for his fork like the last 2 minutes hadn't happened. Like the woman across from him was furniture that had simply been waiting for him to return to it. Claire picked up her own fork, ate 1 bite, set it back down. Nothing about her face had changed. That was the part that would stay with Earl longer than almost anything else that morning. How completely she could disappear into stillness. How much practice it must have taken to make fear look like nothing at all. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know what Dean had done to her, or for how long, or what it had cost her to lift her hand off that table in front of a man like that. But he knew what he'd just been trusted with. Stay with me here, because what happens over the next few minutes in that parking lot is not what anyone in that diner expected to see on a Tuesday morning. Outside, faint at first, then closer, an engine, then another. Dean didn't hear it. He was already talking again, voice low, controlled, already somewhere else in his head. Claire heard it. Her hand tightened around her fork. She didn't know who the man at the next table was. She didn't know his name, his club, what those engines outside meant, or why a stranger with tired eyes and 30 years of road behind him had just decided her life was worth stopping for. To understand that, the story has to go back. Not to this morning. To 7 months before it. 7 months before that morning at the Bristlecone Diner, Claire Whitmore's life fit inside a single word. Small. It wasn't a sad life, or an empty one. Just small, in the way a life becomes when you've built it carefully around the things you can control. She worked the front desk at Amarillo Animal Clinic, out past the edge of town where the buildings thinned out, and the land opened up flat and gold toward the horizon. 6 days a week, 7 in the morning until whenever the last appointment ended. She was good at the job in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork. Dogs trusted her almost immediately. Even the nervous ones, the ones who came in shaking, tails tucked, ears flat against their skulls, would settle the moment she crouched down and let them come to her instead of reaching for them first. Dr. Ellis, who ran the clinic, used to say she had a gift. She didn't think of it as a gift. She thought of it as something simpler. She understood what it looked like when something small and frightened needed you to move slowly. She had a studio apartment 2 miles from the clinic, above a hardware store that had been there since her grandfather's time. She had a coffee maker that took 11 minutes to brew a full pot, and she never once tried to fix that or replace it, because there was something steadying about 11 minutes every morning, where nothing was required of her at all. She had a sister, Renee, 2 years younger, living in Lubbock with a husband and a new baby. They talked every Sunday. That was the rhythm of her life before Dean Corbett walked into it. Quiet, small, entirely her own. He came into the clinic on a Tuesday in March, carrying a golden retriever with a torn pad on its front paw, apologizing before he'd even gotten through the door for the blood on the waiting room floor. He was polished in a way Amarillo men usually weren't. Pressed shirt, a watch that cost more than her monthly rent, the kind of voice that made receptionists in every office he'd ever walked into want to help him first. He remembered her name after hearing it once. He sent flowers to the front desk 2 days later, thanking her for how gentle she'd been with his dog, and the card was handwritten, not printed, which felt, at the time, like the kind of thing a thoughtful man did. For the first 3 months, he was exactly that. Thoughtful, attentive, the kind of attentive that felt, in the beginning, like being finally seen after years of being mostly invisible to men who wanted less complicated things from her. He learned her coffee order. He learned that she didn't like restaurants with open kitchens because the noise made it hard to hear the person across from her. He learned, and remembered, and used what he learned to make himself feel indispensable before she'd even noticed him becoming necessary. That was how it always worked with men like Dean. It never started with a door slamming, or a raised hand on the first night. With attention, with the particular, addictive relief of being studied so closely by someone who seemed to have all the time in the world for you. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. How many warning signs look, at first, exactly like being loved well? The first incident came in June, 3 months in. Small, almost nothing. Renee had invited her to Lubbock for a Saturday, a cousin's birthday, nothing important, and Claire had mentioned it over dinner, expecting nothing more than a nod. Dean's face changed for less than a second. Then he smiled and said he'd just miss her, that was all. And could she maybe go the following month instead, when he wasn't working such long hours, and could actually enjoy a weekend with her? She stayed. She told herself it was sweet. She told herself a man who wanted her around that badly was rare, and rare things were worth adjusting your schedule for. She did not go to Lubbock that month, or the next. The second incident came in August. He started asking, gently at first, why her phone took so long to unlock when he tried to check the weather on it, why she'd stepped outside to take a call from Dr. Ellis about a schedule change, why she'd worn the blue dress to work instead of the gray one he'd said he liked better. None of it, on its own, was anything. That was the design of it. Each question was small enough to answer without a fight, and each answer trained her to explain herself before he even had to ask. By October, she was editing her own life in real time, deciding what was worth mentioning to him and what wasn't, running every plan through a version of him that lived in her head now even when he wasn't in the room. Renee noticed first. She called on a Sunday in November and said, carefully, that Claire sounded different lately. Quieter, like she was reading from a script instead of talking. Claire laughed it off. She said everything was fine. She believed it mostly, because believing it required so much less than the alternative. The third incident happened 2 days before Christmas. Dean had wanted her to skip her family's dinner in Lubbock entirely, to stay in Amarillo for a dinner he was planning with 2 of his business partners, men whose approval seemed to matter to him more than almost anything else in his life. She'd said no, gently but clearly, the way you say no to something you've already decided on. He hadn't yelled. He'd gripped her wrist across the kitchen counter, not hard enough to bruise, not that time, just hard enough that she understood, with total clarity, that the conversation was already over before she'd finished having it. She went to the dinner with his business partners. She told herself it was one night. She told herself Renee would understand. She told herself, lying awake at 2 in the morning while Dean slept beside her without a single thread of guilt visible anywhere on his face, that this was simply what it cost to be loved by someone that intensely. There was a night in January when she almost left. She'd packed half a bag, stood in the doorway of her own apartment with her car keys already in her hand, Renee's number already pulled up on her phone, one thumb hovering over the call button. She didn't press it. Not because she didn't want to leave, because leaving meant admitting, out loud, to her sister, to her mother, to Dr. Ellis, to herself, that the version of her life she'd been describing every Sunday for months had never been true. Shame, it turned out, could hold a door shut just as effectively as a locked one. She put the bag back in the closet. She stayed. Hold on to that image for a moment. A woman standing in her own doorway, keys in hand, unable to make herself turn the lock. It matters more than it looks like right now. And somewhere in the 7 months between that March morning, with the golden retriever, and the Tuesday she sat across from Dean at the Bristlecone Diner with a bruised temple and an arm in a sling, Claire Whitmore had stopped recognizing the sound of her own voice most days. She hadn't stopped hoping things would change. She had just stopped believing hope alone was going to be the thing that changed them. The wrist injury that finally sent Claire to the emergency room happened on a Thursday night in February, 4 months before that morning at the Bristlecone Diner. It wasn't the kitchen counter this time. Dean had wanted her to cancel a coffee she'd planned with a coworker from the clinic. Nothing more than that. An hour, maybe less. And when she'd said she'd already told the woman yes, his hand had come down on her wrist as she reached for her car keys, twisting it just enough, just fast enough, that something in the joint made a sound she felt before she heard it. He apologized within the hour. He always did. He drove her to Northside Regional himself, sat in the waiting room the entire time, told the intake nurse she'd slipped getting out of the shower. Claire didn't correct him. The nurse who wrapped her wrist that night was named Marlene Voss. 51 years old, 22 years in that same emergency room, the kind of nurse who could look at a patient for 4 seconds and already know most of what she needed to know before a single test came back. She'd seen Claire's story 100 times before it ever left Claire's mouth. Marlene worked in silence for a while. Gauze, tape, the practiced motion of hands that had done this thousands of times. The room smelled like rubbing alcohol, and the particular metallic cold of the air conditioning turned up too high for comfort, the way emergency rooms always seem to be kept. Then, without looking up, she said something quiet. "You don't have to explain anything to me." Claire hadn't planned to, but something about the way Marlene said it, no judgment in it, no pity either, just a flat, steady kind of understanding, made the explanation come out anyway, in pieces, unplanned. Marlene listened without interrupting once. When Claire finished, Marlene finished taping the gauze, set Claire's arm gently back down, and reached into the pocket of her scrubs for a pen. She didn't write anything down. Instead, she held up her own hand, palm turned inward toward her chest, fingers spread wide. "Most women in your situation only ever have one hand free," she said. "The other one's usually busy holding something, or being held, so whatever you use has to work with just this." She held the position, steady. Hand up, palm toward your own heart, fingers open. Hold it 3 seconds, not 2, not 5, 3 is long enough for someone paying attention to notice, and short enough that it looks like nothing to someone who isn't. Claire watched her hand. "Who taught you that?" she asked. Marlene lowered her hand and finally looked at her directly. "A patient of mine," she said. "About 11 years ago. She didn't make it out in time for it to save her. But she made sure I never forgot it, and I've made sure I never stopped passing it along since." She didn't say the woman's name. Claire didn't ask. "You won't need it tonight," Marlene said, tearing off a final strip of tape. "You probably won't need it tomorrow either. That's not the point of learning it." Claire practiced it once, right there in the exam room, her injured wrist resting in her lap, her good hand rising slowly to her chest. Palm in, fingers open, 3 seconds. It felt foolish, small, like something that couldn't possibly matter against a man who'd just twisted her wrist hard enough to need an X-ray. She thanked Marlene anyway, mostly out of politeness, and went home with Dean that night, and didn't think about the gesture again for a long time. She didn't think she'd ever have a reason to use it. That changed on a Tuesday morning, 4 months later, in a diner on Route 9, the instant a stranger with tired eyes happened to be looking her way at exactly the right moment. Monday night, 4 days after Claire's temple had been bruised in a version of an accident nobody in the room believed, Dean found the photograph on her phone. Nothing dramatic. Just a picture Renee had sent, her nephew, 3 weeks old, asleep in a knitted blanket the color of the Texas sky in October. Claire had smiled at it in the kitchen while he wasn't looking, or so she'd thought. He'd seen the smile. That was the part that mattered to him. "You've been talking to her again," he said. Not a question. She didn't deny it. There was no version of denying it that would have gone better than telling the truth. What followed wasn't loud. It rarely was, with Dean. It was a long, quiet, methodical unraveling of every reason her sister was a bad influence. Every reason Claire's family had never understood what real commitment looked like. Every reason it might be time for her to stop answering when Renee called. Then he told her about tomorrow. Breakfast. 7:30. 2 of his business partners would be there. Men he needed to impress for a land deal that had been unraveling for weeks. And she would come. And she would smile. And she would not, under any circumstances, mention her sister, her job, or anything that made her sound like a woman with a life of her own. She said yes. She always said yes to the version of Tuesday that ended fastest. But something in her, that night, lying awake in the dark beside a man breathing evenly and dreamlessly next to her, calculated something she hadn't let herself calculate in months. This wasn't going to stop. It wouldn't stop tomorrow, and it wouldn't stop next month. There was no version of patience or good behavior or careful silence that led out of this, only one that led further in. She didn't decide anything that night. She wasn't ready to decide anything yet. But for the first time in a long while, she lay there wondering what Marlene Voss's hand had looked like, held up in that cold exam room 4 months earlier. Palm in, fingers open. She fell asleep still turning the shape of it over in her mind, the way you turn over a key to a door you're not sure you're allowed to open yet. Earl Dunmore had been sitting in that same corner booth at the Bristlecone Diner every Tuesday morning for 6 years. Not out of habit exactly, out of something closer to a promise he'd made to himself and never talked about with anyone in his chapter, not even Ray, who'd known him longer than almost anybody alive. 9 years earlier, a woman named Carol Ann Whitfield, married to a man in Earl's own chapter, a good man, steady, the kind who'd ride through a hailstorm for a brother without being asked twice, had walked into Harbor Light Shelter on a Tuesday morning with a broken collarbone and a story that had nothing to do with her husband and everything to do with the boss she worked for at a title company 2 towns over. Earl hadn't known. Nobody in the chapter had known. She'd been quiet about it the way people are quiet about things they've decided are theirs alone to carry. She got out. She was fine now, remarried, living outside Lubbock with 2 kids, and a life that looked nothing like that year had looked. But the not knowing had stayed with Earl in a specific, uncomfortable way. The knowledge that he'd sat across from her at chapter cookouts a dozen times that year, and never once seen what was right in front of him, because he hadn't known what he was supposed to be looking for. After that, he'd gone to Harbor Light himself, asked questions most men in his position never bothered to ask, He'd learned the signal. He'd learned there were dozens of versions of it, taught quietly, hand to hand, nurse to patient, teacher to student, shelter worker to shelter worker, small gestures built to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them on purpose. But he'd never used it, not once, in 9 years. But every Tuesday morning, he sat in that corner booth with his back to the wall, ordered eggs he sometimes forgot to eat, and watched the door. Not because he expected anything, because Carol Ann had taught him, without ever meaning to, exactly how much it costs a person when nobody in the room is paying attention. If you've made it this far, ask yourself honestly, would you have noticed a hand rising slowly off a diner table, or would you have kept eating your breakfast like everyone else in that room did? The bell above the diner door rang at 7:28 that Tuesday morning. Dean came in first, phone already in hand, scanning the room in the particular unhurried way of a man used to spaces rearranging themselves around him. Claire came in behind him. Earl looked up, the way he looked up every time that door opened, and something in the set of her shoulders told him everything he needed to know before either of them had said a single word. They sat 2 booths down. Dean pulled her down into the seat harder than the moment required, his phone ringing, hard and sudden, some call he clearly hadn't expected, and she dropped into the booth off balance, hip first, catching herself on the table edge. Earl's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He'd seen 100 small moments like it over the years and let most of them go, because not every hard landing in a diner booth meant what he was afraid it might mean. But her eyes came up, found his, held there for exactly as long as it takes to know you've been seen and are deciding whether that's a mistake. Then her hand rose off the table. Palm turned in, fingers spread, chest height. Earl set his fork down without a sound. He watched her hold that position, 3 full seconds, her hand trembling the entire time, holding still anyway, the way Carol Ann must have held still 9 years ago in a room he'd never walked into in time. He was in time now. Dean's voice sharpened behind his phone, oblivious, already 3 sentences deep into some negotiation that mattered more to him than the woman across from him. Earl reached into his vest, pulled out the flip phone he'd carried, unchanged, for longer than some of his brothers had been alive. Opened it, typed 4 words, Bristlecone Diner, Route 9, closed it, slid it back into his vest, picked his coffee back up, hands steady, face unreadable, the way 34 years of practice had taught him to be steady when everything underneath was anything but. Claire looked back down at her plate. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what came next, or whether anything would come next at all, or whether she'd just handed a stranger something he'd simply forget by the time his coffee went cold. She only knew that she'd done it, that the hand had gone up, and someone's eyes had actually found it. For the first time in 3 years, waiting didn't feel like nothing. Outside, far off down Route 9, something low and steady began to hum against the morning air. Neither of them heard it yet, but it was already on its way. The sound reached the parking lot 11 seconds before it reached the diner. Low, steady, building. By the time Dean noticed anything at all, 4 motorcycles were already rolling off Route 9, one after another, unhurried, engines dropping from a rumble to something closer to a held breath as they came to a stop around his car. One in front, one behind. 2 on either side. Dean's business partners hadn't arrived yet. He was alone at the table with Claire, his phone finally back in his jacket, cutting into a plate of eggs he'd ordered, without asking what she wanted. He didn't look up right away. Then the shadow of a rider passed the window, and something in him, some old, animal part that had nothing to do with the confidence he wore like a second jacket, noticed before his mind caught up. He looked out at the lot. 4 bikes, 4 men, not moving, not looking at him, just present, the way weather is present. "What is this?" he said. Not loud, not yet. Claire didn't answer. She was looking at her plate. Earl stood up from the corner booth. He didn't hurry. He never hurried. He walked the short distance between his table and theirs, the way a man walks when he has already decided everything that's going to happen, and is simply arriving at the part where it happens. He stopped beside their table. He didn't sit down. He didn't introduce himself. He set a phone on the table between them, his own, screen lit, a number already connecting. Harbor Light Shelter, he said. 30 minutes north. Dean's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Excuse me? Earl didn't look at him. He was looking at Claire, and only at Claire, the way you look at someone when you're handing them something too important to rush. Your choice, he said. Nobody else's. Claire's hand came up off her lap, slow, and closed around the phone. Dean stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. You don't touch her phone, you don't touch mine, and you sure as hell don't. She's not touching yours, Earl said. She's touching mine. 4 words. No heat in them at all. That was the part that unsettled Dean more than shouting would have, the complete absence of anything to push against. Claire held the phone to her ear and stood, quiet, and walked toward the back hallway past the storage shelves and the old ice machine Ray had been meaning to fix for 8 months, out through the side door, into the white morning heat. She didn't look back. Dean started after her. Earl didn't move to stop him. He simply stood where he was, between the table and the hallway, and said nothing at all, and somehow that said everything. Dean stopped 2 steps in. He turned back toward the window instead, toward the parking lot, toward the 4 men still sitting on their bikes, with the particular patience of men who had absolutely nowhere else to be. Move your bikes, he said. Now. Nobody moved. He said it again, louder. Nothing. He walked outside, slammed the door hard enough that the bell above it rang twice. He got into his car, gripped the wheel, and honked the horn, long and furious and useless. Not one rider so much as glanced his way. That was when Dean understood, in the particular slow way that men like him understand things, that this wasn't a negotiation. There was nobody in that parking lot interested in what he wanted, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, wanting something loudly enough wasn't going to be sufficient to get it. He called someone. 26 minutes later, a black truck pulled into the lot. 2 men got out, big, deliberate, the kind of hired certainty that men like Dean kept on a short list for exactly this kind of afternoon. They worked private security for Corbett Land and Cattle, Dean's development company, and they'd been told there was a situation that needed handling before the noon meeting. They walked toward the bikes. One of them pointed at Earl and said something sharp, meant to provoke. Earl finished his cigarette. Didn't answer. Didn't so much as shift his weight. None of the other 3 riders answered either. The 2 men looked at each other. They'd come ready for a fight. What they hadn't come ready for was 4 men who simply refused to give them one. No raised voice, no posture, nothing to push against, nothing to win. Dean got out of his car and walked straight up to Earl, closer than the moment called for, close enough to be a statement all on its own. You have no idea who I am, he said. Earl dropped his cigarette, pressed it out under his boot. Then he looked past Dean's shoulder, toward the dashboard of his car, where a small red light blinked steady on the windshield-mounted camera Dean himself had installed 6 months earlier to protect his business from lawsuits. Dean followed his gaze. Understood, in one long, cold second, exactly what that camera had been recording since the moment he'd walked out of that diner. One of Earl's men lifted a phone, took a single photo of the license plate. No announcement, no drama. Just a quiet, deliberate motion, over before Dean's security even registered it. The 2 hired men exchanged a look, got back in their truck, and left without another word. Dean stood alone in the lot for a moment, and then he turned his anger somewhere it had never gone before that morning. He walked back toward Earl and stopped close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You'll regret this, he said, quiet now, quieter than before, which was somehow worse. You have no idea what I can do to a man like you. A phone call. 1 phone call to the county, and that clubhouse of yours gets a health inspection every week for a year. Another phone call, and every one of your brothers with a business license in this county finds out what a permit review looks like. Earl didn't answer right away. For 1 second, something crossed his face that Maddie, watching from the window, had never seen on him before. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the tired weight of a man who has spent 34 years building something with his brothers and knows exactly how fragile it can be made to look on paper, no matter how solid it is in practice. He'd seen it happen to other chapters: zoning complaints, sudden audits, the slow bureaucratic strangulation that men with money used when they couldn't win any other way. "Maybe," Earl said finally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deny it could happen. "But you'll still be the man who did what you did to her," he said. "And I'll still be the man who was there. That's not something a phone call changes." Dean stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned, got back in his car, and drove off 11 minutes later without another word. Maddie, watching through the front window with a coffee pot still in her hand, said quietly to no one in particular, "He's not going to let this go." Ray, who'd come out from the garage bay at the sound of the horn, wiped his hands on a rag and stood beside her. "No," he said, "he's not, and neither one of us should either." Earl didn't follow Dean. He rode to Harbor Light Shelter instead, alone, 30 minutes north on a 2-lane road that ran flat and gold in every direction, and waited in the parking lot until a woman from the intake desk came out to tell him, in a voice trained not to promise more than it should, that Claire Whitmore was inside. Safe. Quiet. Beginning. That word, beginning, was the one that stayed with him the whole ride back. Because for Claire, something had genuinely started that morning. For Dean, something else had started too. And neither of them yet understood how far either one was going to go, or what it might cost the man who'd stepped between them. 3 days passed at the Bristlecone Diner, and nothing happened at all. That was the strange part. No confrontation, no phone call, no black truck pulling back into the lot. Just an ordinary stretch of ordinary mornings, the kind that made Maddie wonder, quietly, if maybe it really was over. Ray didn't think so. He'd spent 22 years in the Marine Corps learning to read the space between what a man says and what he actually intends. And something about the silence coming from Dean Corbett's direction felt less like peace and more like a held breath. He was right. On the 4th day, a lawyer named Preston Hale showed up at the diner just after the lunch rush, wearing a suit that cost more than the diner's monthly electric bill, and asked politely to speak with the owner. Ray came out from the garage bay, hands still smelling of engine grease. Hale explained, in the calm, unhurried tone of a man who bills by the hour, that his client had reason to believe certain individuals at this establishment had interfered with a private family matter. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that harassment and false imprisonment were serious charges. He mentioned that 4 unidentified motorcyclists blocking a citizen's vehicle in a public parking lot was, technically, a crime, and that his client was still deciding whether to press it. He also mentioned, more quietly, the county zoning complaint that had already been filed against the diner's back lot, the one used for motorcycle parking on Tuesday mornings. Ray didn't raise his voice. "Your client can decide whatever he wants," he said. "We've got cameras too." Hale smiled, thin and practiced, and left a card on the counter. That afternoon, a different visit reached Claire's mother, a widow named Patsy Whitmore, who lived alone on the south side of Amarillo, with a chain-link fence and a dog too old to bark anymore. Dean came himself this time. He stood on her porch, calm, well-dressed, and told her he only wanted to know that Claire was safe. Patsy said she didn't know where her daughter was, which was the truth. Dean leaned in close anyway, and said something quiet enough that Patsy never repeated it to anyone, not even the detective who asked her directly 2 weeks later. She locked the door after he left. Her hands were shaking too hard to get the deadbolt on the first try. For a few days it looked like it might actually work, like money and a good lawyer and enough quiet, careful pressure might simply make the whole situation dissolve before it ever reached a courtroom. The young officer who'd taken Earl's report the week before had been told by his supervisor to slow down, that Corbett Land and Cattle was a significant local employer, that nobody wanted to move too fast on a case built entirely on a biker's word and a license plate. That was the low point. For 4 days, it seemed entirely possible that Dean Corbett was going to walk away from all of it with nothing more than an inconvenienced Tuesday, and that Earl's chapter might pay a real price for a morning of decency. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the part of the story most people forget by the time they get to the ending. Doing the right thing rarely comes with a guarantee that it will work out. Earl didn't know it would. He did it anyway. Then, on the 5th day, the plate came back. The officer's name was Grant Michaels, 26 years old, 3 years on the force, and he'd almost laughed out loud the day a Hells Angels member walked into the precinct lobby in full colors and left a folded piece of paper on the counter like he was returning library books. He'd run the plate out of boredom more than duty. What came back stopped him cold. The name Dean Corbett was already in the system, connected to a missing persons case filed 2 years earlier involving a woman named Nora Fisk, and connected to 3 prior domestic violence complaints filed by 3 different women, every one of them withdrawn before reaching a courtroom. Same pattern each time. Woman files. Woman recants. Case closed. Nora Fisk had been 26 years old when she disappeared. She'd worked at a flower shop on the east side of Amarillo, the kind of job where her hands always smelled faintly of eucalyptus and cut stems, no matter how many times she washed them. Her co-workers said she hummed while she worked, always the same 3 or 4 songs, never explaining where she'd learned them. On weekends, she made jewelry. Nothing complicated. Beads and wire and whatever caught her eye at the craft store on Saturday mornings. The kind of small, careful work that asks for patience rather than skill. She'd been with Dean for 14 months before she left him, or tried to, on a Thursday in October, 2 years before that Tuesday morning at the Bristlecone Diner. Her family filed a missing persons report 4 days after she stopped answering her phone. The police investigated, talked to Dean. He was calm, cooperative, said she had left him, said it was mutual, said she'd mentioned wanting to see the coast, maybe California. She'd always talked about it. He said he didn't know exactly where. He said he hoped she was doing well. The detective assigned to the case noted, at the time, that Dean presented as credible, no signs of deception, no inconsistencies in his account. The case went cold within 11 months. Nora's mother had called the detective every 3 weeks for the first year, then every month, then less, not because she stopped believing something was wrong, but because believing something is wrong and being able to do anything about it are 2 entirely different things to carry for 2 years. Grant sat with all of it for a long moment before he picked up his phone and called his supervisor directly, bypassing the chain of command that had told him to slow down. The search warrant for Dean's car was approved the following morning. They found the bracelet under the passenger seat, wrapped in cloth, tucked back against the frame where it wouldn't shift when the car moved. Blue and white beads, a small silver hummingbird charm, the kind of thing a person makes with their own hands on a quiet Saturday morning. Nora Fisk's mother identified it from a photograph that same afternoon, sitting in a plastic chair in a room that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner. She looked at the photo for a long time before she spoke. She never took it off, she said. Her voice was steady, in the particular way of someone who has been preparing for this moment for 2 years, without ever wanting it to arrive. She made it herself, the mother added. The summer before. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The investigation into Nora Fisk's disappearance reopened that same day. 12 miles north, at Harbor Light Shelter, Claire Whitmore was learning how to be still in a different way than she'd practiced for 3 years. She had her own room now, a narrow bed, a window that faced a stretch of empty field, a phone the shelter had given her with a number nobody else knew. On the 6th night, she picked it up and called her sister herself. Renee answered on the first ring, the way she always had, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, just the sound of breathing on both ends of the line, and somewhere in the background, a baby beginning to fuss. "I'm okay," Claire said finally. "I should have called you months ago." "I know," Renee said. "I would have come and gotten you myself." "I know that too." It wasn't a long conversation. It didn't need to be. But it was the first phone call in 3 years that Claire had made entirely on her own, to the person she wanted to talk to, for no reason except that she wanted to, and when she hung up, she sat for a while in the quiet of that narrow room, feeling something in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of her own life again. Remember that image from earlier, a woman standing in her own doorway, unable to make herself turn the lock. This is the same hand, finally doing something for no one's sake but her own. Dean was arrested 9 days after that morning at the Bristlecone Diner. It happened outside his office on a Thursday afternoon. No dramatics, no chase. 2 patrol cars, 4 officers, and Dean standing very still in the parking lot of Corbett Land and Cattle, while the cuffs went on. Maddie Sawyer was there, having driven to town for the day, and she watched from across the street with her arms crossed, saying nothing, until a local reporter asked if she had any comment. "He walked into our diner like he owned it," she said. "Now he doesn't own anything." Ray Holloway, standing beside her, added only one thing when asked. "There were 4 bikes in that parking lot that morning," he said. "There are 2 women who never got that chance. We didn't forget either one of them. The charges took weeks to formalize, the way these things always do. A system that moves at its own pace, no matter how urgent the people caught inside it feel. But by spring, Dean Corbett faced charges connected to Nora Fisk's death, along with counts tied to Claire and to 2 of the earlier women whose withdrawn complaints were finally being re-examined in light of everything the bracelet had reopened. In the courtroom on the day he was formally charged, Dean said only one thing to the judge, quiet enough that the reporters in the back row had to lean forward to catch it. "I didn't think anyone was paying attention." It wasn't an apology. But it was the closest thing to the truth he had ever said out loud, and something in his face, for just a moment, looked less like a man who'd lost an argument, and more like a man beginning, for the first time, to understand exactly what he'd spent years building, and exactly what it had cost other people. Earl didn't attend the hearing. He'd done what he came to do the morning the bikes rolled into that parking lot, and the zoning complaint against the diner's back lot was quietly withdrawn 2 weeks after Dean's arrest, though nobody ever confirmed why. He'd never been a man who needed to watch the ending to know it had happened. 6 months later, on a cool morning in October, Earl rode back out to the Bristlecone Diner, the way he had every week since March. Maddie had a new girl training at the counter that day, 19 years old, name of Dana, fresh out of high school and still learning where everything was kept. Earl didn't say much to her. He never did, with people he hadn't decided to trust yet. But he watched Maddie take a laminated card down from behind the register, the hotline number, and beneath it, a small illustration of a hand, palm turned inward, fingers spread, and show it to Dana without making it into a lesson or a warning. "If you ever see someone do this," Maddie said, "you call. That's all. Just call." Dana looked at the card for a long moment, then nodded, the way people nod when something has just become a little more real to them than it was a minute earlier. Earl finished his coffee, left a few bills on the counter. On his way out, he glanced at the edge of that same counter, where the laminate had worn thin from years of hands resting there, and where, if you knew to look, a handful of small marks had been scratched into the corner with a key. Nobody who didn't know what they meant would ever notice them. He did. He always would. There is a version of courage that gets remembered loudly. Sirens, headlines, the roar of engines arriving just in time. That's not the version that mattered most in this story. The version that mattered most was smaller than that. It was a hand, raised slowly in a diner booth, trembling the whole time it stayed still. It was a nurse, in a cold exam room, choosing to teach a stranger something she never had to teach anyone. It was a man who had failed to notice something once, 9 years earlier, and decided that failure would never happen twice on his watch again, even when a lawyer threatened everything he'd spent 3 decades building. Dignity, most days, doesn't announce itself. It just shows up, quietly, on time, paying attention when it would have been easier not to, and staying steady when staying steady had a real price attached to it. Somewhere in Amarillo tonight, there's a diner counter with a handful of small marks scratched into one corner, and a laminated card by the register that most customers will never look at twice. That's the whole point of it. It isn't there for the people who don't need it. It's there for the one person who might, on an ordinary Tuesday, need exactly that much and nothing more. There's one more thing worth saying before this story ends. Nobody who helped that Tuesday morning, Earl, Maddie, Ray, Grant, ever met each other beforehand, and most of them never spoke about it afterward. They didn't need credit. They needed the outcome. That, more than anything else, is the quiet math this whole story runs on. Attention plus action, with no requirement that anyone ever finds out your name. That's what this story was always about. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233, available free and confidential, 24 hours a day. If you are in immediate danger, please call 911. This story is a work of fiction created for Heart Tales. All characters, names, locations, and events are entirely fictional. Narration in this video was produced with AI voice assistance. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever been the one who looked away, or the one who finally didn't, tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for watching Heart Tales. If this is your first time here, subscribe. New stories every week about ordinary people doing things nobody saw coming. And before you go, 2 more stories are waiting for you on screen right now. We'll see you there.